similarly with the reports in the UK. And there's just been this constant effort to try and get a formula that will pay for performance by the individual and the company, align the interests of directors and shareholders, report back to shareholders via a remuneration committee, keep contracts relatively short and simple so that you don't get an enormous payment for failure. How difficult is it? Well, 20 years on, we're still struggling with it. And of course, the problem never goes away. It wasn't in financial services. In the late 90s, this was a pharmaceutical company, SmithKline Beecham, trying to defend a 93 million pay packet. And of course, recently, though, financial services are right at the heart of this, and investment bank pay is seen as being egregious. But it's not just financial services. There's a general complaint that the gap between the payments of those at the top and those at the bottom, or those who are on the average of the company, has now got far too stretched. But re-regulation is difficult here because there's still plenty of jurisdictions that will say, don't worry, come here, you can pay people as much as you like. So it's a bit of the same problem as the financial transaction tax, that in some ways it might be a good idea, but it's very difficult to act unilaterally. We've had lots of stuff on internal controls, which of course is particularly important for financial services companies. Let's just pick out... let's skip to the wake of the crisis, where there's lots of regulation, prescription even about going concern and liquidity. But one of the many problems with this is if you read through this list, a systematic approach to learning from failure, do stress tests. Excuse me, how could you ever manage risk without doing that? So you constantly get... Well, you often get in corporate governance regulation things that are actually in many ways either obvious or even banal, and the problem has been that the behaviour, that actually that's not what happened on the board, or that questions weren't being asked. You didn't have those wonderful prompts that Edward talked about in terms of challenge, provocation, what if, alternative thinking. And you've had this has been... One of the things about this is, and we'll come on to the bigger issues, is that it's been regulatory-led rather than led from the boardroom, which is a pity. And increasingly the governments are getting involved with it. You've even had suggestions of a separate financial reporting and auditing system for banks. I personally don't think that's necessary, although actually through accounting standards and various other specific regulation for banks, you are obviously getting additional reporting for financial services companies. That's why their annual reports are twice as long as everybody else's, with HSBC holding the record at 400 and something pages. I don't criticise them for that. They are a large and complex company producing an annual report that's, if you got rid of the pictures, would still be shorter than the paperback novels that most people read on the beach here in a day. And this is a company, with assets of perhaps 1,500 billion pounds and employing hundreds of thousands of people. So actually, an annual report of 400 pages seems proportionate to me, but there we are. And of course, now in the wake of the crisis, we do indeed have a heavier burden for financial services companies. In the UK, Sir David Walker ran through some of these issues, but the first thing he talked about was the behavioural problem and the fact that there was a lack of challenge. Now, how do you legislate for that? And of course, the regulators have to attempt to legislate for that. So you've got the idea, well, the board has to have enough people with financial expertise. Well, who's going to interview for that? It's supposed to be a nomination committee exercise. Now the Financial Services Authority interviews candidates. Is this corporate governance, or is this micromanaging by the regulator? You've got the idea of time. There's even been suggestions of that minimum times should be laid down. Now, it's always disappointed me that non-executive directors spend so much time on the job. They do. When the first concern was first raised about this by Derek Higgs about 10 years ago, they were doing 20 or 30 days a year. Now it's sort of still only about 30 to 40. This is ridiculous. They'll have at least one board meeting a month, so that's 12. They'll all each be on 2 of the three or 4 other committees. 20 to 30 days only really gives you the days of the committees. Well, surely you need at least that for every day of committee meeting. You need a day of preparation. So there is a problem with time being spent, but I'm not quite sure how you legislate for that. On financial services companies, it is now clear that the job of chairman and of chairman of the audit committee, this is a part-time job. We aren't talking about a couple of days a month here. There's annual elections, which is actually rather a good prompt to shareholders to have a think every year about whether or not they think the people are doing their jobs, or even if you only get a sort of 10-15% vote against, it can be quite a useful jolt to the system. And you've got much more regulation of stewardship, i.e. shareholders engaging with companies and voting. And you've got further tweaking of the risk committee and so on. And of course it fed into pay regulation. I just use pay regulation as an example, really, because just as an example to show how prescriptive this stuff is getting. You would think that a company's top management, the board, should be the ones setting pay. And it's very sad that we've got to a position where, in an industry where pay of staff is the single biggest cost, for some reason, boards were not up to the job of keeping that cost under control. Even in the wake of the financial crisis, when banks lost a lot of money, it was extraordinarily... then they said, oh, well, of course, the pay will flex downwards. It's bonus, it's variable. Actually, it didn't flex downwards in the way that you would have expected. So it didn't even do what it was supposed to do. So you get these... I won't even read this out, but it's just an example of this is the regulator doing the board's job. Why doesn't the board do the job itself? And we've got other things aimed at banks, including the bonus tax, the bank levy that was mentioned earlier, which in 2010 raised £3.5 billion. So obviously, if you had a financial transaction tax, you'd have to. In places like the UK, you'd have to sweep away the bank levy, which is actually more risk-based, sweep away stamp duty, which I'm not a great fan of actually, and you'd substitute financial transaction tax for it, and perhaps, as John Vella was saying, it would be much less well targeted, and so on. And we've got more regulations proposed on pay, including binding shareholder votes, not having other serving executives on the remuneration committee on the basis that it turned into a sort of back-scratching exercise. You know, you put my pay up and somebody like me will put your pay up. And you've still got this pious hope that the best practice will be led by business and the investor community. Now, the good news is that the investor community is finally getting off its backside and starting to do something about this, because they've noticed that profits that should be flowing to them are actually being greatly diminished by the very high staff costs. So they are beginning to do something about it. And they get particularly annoyed, obviously, if a high payment is made to someone who hasn't performed very well. So this is why we've had a very, very interesting annual meeting season. But shareholder engagement is actually now is a really important area of this. The UK has a stewardship code. It's a very boring code. Disclosure policy, manage conflicts of interest. Why wouldn't you? I mean, monitor companies. Yeah, why haven't you been doing that? Be willing to act collectively is actually probably the most interesting one, because in some ways, in order to get challenge to a board, shareholders do need to get together. It's the same as any other sort of collective action. It's much better if you can get a sort of critical mass of people who are worried or want to object. But in the past, some of the concert party rules have acted against that. So I think this could be one of the more interesting areas, making it easier for shareholders to act together. Having said that, informally, when the chips have been down at many companies, they've done that anyway. And you've also got some quite difficult issues in terms of how do you enforce this or supervise it. I mean, in the UK, domestic institutions hold less than 40% of the market. As it happens, some of the big foreign institutions investing in companies quoted on the FTSE, quoted on the London market, have signed up to the stewardship code, so you can you can have some extraterritorial sort of traction with this. You've got the big row over holding periods. I mean, do shareholders care if the average holding period is 7 months? That is actually a very, very misleading statistic, because the holding periods are greatly diluted by higher frequency trading.